We'll get started in just a couple minutes. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are slightly behind schedule, but we have plenty of time. It is 10:54. Today is June the 2nd, 2023. We are meeting on a work session for AR 2023-188S, a resolution of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly supporting a plan for sanctioned camps within the municipality of Anchorage. This is a draft document. The Assembly hasn't taken a position yet. We have a number of people in the room who are interested parties. But first, we will go ahead and make introductions. So I'll start over here.
George Martinez.
Cameron Perez-Padilla.
Karen Bronga. Anna Brawley.
Zach Johnson.
Christopher Constant.
Felix Rivera.
Alexis Johnson. I'm being joined by Michael Hughes from the Anchorage Health Department.
Thank you. And on the phone, we have members Salt and Myers. Are you there? Okay, I think I heard both of them. And we also are honored by the presence of Representative Andrew Gray in the room and plenty of other folks. So the theory of today's conversation is going to be an hour of introduction and conversation by Mr. Rivera and the work of the task force. And then there's maybe another conversation that will be following on. Mr. Presverdia had asked to make sure that we had plenty of time for some alternative perspectives. And so that's the baseline for this conversation. This is a work session, generally not an opportunity for public participation. We'll see where we get towards the end of the meeting. If there is an opportunity, we may. But with that, I'm going to hand over the floor to Mr. Rivera.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's go ahead and put up the presentation, please. Wonderful. All right. Hello, everyone. I know your calendar is probably quite busy because of me, so I want to thank you in advance. Apologize that this isn't going to be a fancy Ali Hartman presentation, but so please bear with me. Just want to start a little bit just like I did with the resolution creating the Sanctioned Camp Task Force, just talking a little bit about sanctioned camps, just briefly, and understanding the stigma attached to those two words, sanctioned camps. But truly, as I have said from the beginning, sanctioned camps, I use it as an umbrella term. And you will see as we go through this that sanctioned camps can take a lot of different forms, a lot of different shapes, and serve a lot of different populations. Before we get started, I also want to give a heartfelt thank you to all of the task force members for the many hours of meetings, emotions, and energy it took us to get to this place today, and for the continued work that you're going to be doing over the course of the next month or so. Next slide, please. So there's going to be a lot to cover today. The goal is twofold: to help folks understand how we got to the situation we are in, both the positive and the negative, and then to discuss the sanctioned camp resolution. Caveat, this is not going to be a comprehensive look at homelessness. I'm not going to be talking about the work done in the facilitated collaborative process or any work done in previous administrations. If there's interest in that, that's a totally separate and lengthy work session. Next slide, please. So let's take a journey back to July of 2022, to what many of us dubbed as a humanitarian crisis. Members Perez Verdia, Voland, and myself put forward this two-pronged plan to address this situation. We wanted to do a few things: address the closure of the Sullivan as a mass care site, what was going on at Centennial, and then prepare for emergency cold weather shelter months down the line. Next slide, please. So as you all saw at the last Housing and Homelessness Committee meeting, the Assembly has made a wide variety of housing investments. The only really near-term investments we made last year were for the hotel conversions. All of the other investments are much longer-term investments. Now, last year when we approved this in August, I naively thought at the time that these projects would be able to come online by the end of the year, end of 2022, and that we'd be able to close the Sullivan by January 1st. Well, obviously that didn't happen. Next slide, please. Although we forward funded some work for emergency cold weather shelter back in July, the work to actually formulate a plan and fund the plan was delayed until August, September, October timeframe. So as you can see, some of the parts of the plan didn't come to fruition. So the Beans Cafe plank of the plan didn't happen because of some insurance issues. And then we're still waiting on the former Golden Line to be turned on as housing. And that'll happen by the end of this month. Next slide, please. So back in January 1, I started talking about the need to demobilize emergency cold weather shelter. So we spent all of this time and energy and funding to stand up emergency cold weather shelter. We also needed to spend a lot of time and energy thinking about how we're going to demobilize emergency cold weather shelter. So the administration presented their plan in February. Then I led a process in committee in March to get us to a plan that we approved in April. That is the plan we approved in April is best described as an all hands on deck approach. So section 2 of this speaks to RFIs and putting out an RFI for non-congregate facilities. We never got any responses to that RFI that was put out, unfortunately. And section 3 of this ordinance, of this resolution that was passed, really got wrapped into the Sanctioned Camp Community Task Force. Next slide, please. The private donor that's tied to section 5, which is the old Alaska Native charter school, is probably looking at using their money elsewhere. And then we also funded section 6 during the first quarter budget revisions, which we're going to get to soon. And then we created the task forces in sections 7 and 8. So the Sanctioned Camp Community Task Force and the Complex Behavioral Health Needs Community Task Force in April, and they are running smoothly and doing their work. On the creation of the Sanctioned Camp Community Task Force, my initial suggestion when we planned this out in committee was that the report from the Sanctioned Camp Community Task Force would be due in September, because I knew that planning efforts for sanctioned camps can take up to 6 months. They don't have to, but they can take that long to plan sanctioned camps. Well, other assembly members pushed for getting that work done much quicker so we could get a sanctioned camp or camps up and running this summer. June was proposed by some, and the compromise was that the report be due as close to July 1 as possible, which is how we got to the July 6th deadline for the report of the Sanctioned Camp Community Task Force. Next slide, please. So as part of the first quarter budget process, we funded a variety of needs, some of it tied to demobilization of emergency cold weather shelter and preventing additional folks from becoming homeless, and other parts tied to bolstering the year-round safety net. This slide was created by Ali and is taken from a separate presentation I put together in early May called "The Sullivan is Closed, and Now What?" Next slide, please. So that was a lot of information. So quick recap. A flurry of policy and funding decisions were made, plans were put forward, task forces were created, all generating from the end of mass care in June of 2022, and then the closure of emergency shelter in April and May of this year. Next slide, please. So how will all of this work impact this summer? So the way I see it, there are 2 planning scenarios. Planning scenario A, where we keep a status quo of the current camping situation happening in our community, get 203 housing units online and filled, which isn't nearly as easy as it sounds, and really relying on outreach to fill the gaps and provide basic needs for folks in encampments. This scenario keeps roughly 450 in an unsanctioned encampment posture. Or planning scenario B, where we create sanctioned camps and get those housing units online. Again, not as easy as it sounds. There is a large range for us to consider in terms of number of sanctioned camps and populations, but the numbers on this slide assume all camp locations move forward and that they are all at max capacity. We still rely heavily on outreach, but as you'll see in the resolution, we really call on community members to help out specifically at these sanctioned sites. Now, I've said this so many times over the last few months that some of you are probably sick of me saying it, but no matter what we do, we need to face the reality that there are going to be unsheltered individuals in our community, period. So even under planning scenario B, it keeps 150 individuals in an unsanctioned encampment posture. Next slide, please. Now, I think what's really critical for folks to think about, and is on the top of my mind, is planning for the upcoming winter. I know we just finished winter, but we have to start planning for next winter already. We're going to go through this exercise in much more detail at the Housing and Homelessness Committee meeting on June 8th. But on this slide, you can see the preliminary numbers we might have to plan for under both scenarios. Of note, both assume we get that permanent year-round low-barrier shelter I've been talking about up and running by November 1. Also, you'll notice in addition in the math for planning scenario B, that's because not all of the camps are proposed to be year-round. So that proposes that some camps will close, and that will increase the number of unsheltered individuals in unsanctioned encampments. All right, so next slide, please. That was a lot. So any questions on that before we go into the sanctioned camp resolution? Awesome. That made sense to everyone. Wonderful. All right.
Mr. Rivera, I think I have a question/comment. So thank you. That was really helpful to go through it. And I think, I guess what I'm curious about is my microphone crackling a lot? Is how much that sank in with numbers of, does that all make sense? And that, I guess part of it for me is that part of what you said that I think was really valuable is there have been a lot of plans, and a lot of plans have been put into place, and there's been a lot of investment put into those plans that is currently working right now. Whether you agree that it's working well or not, things are happening right now. And so part of what I think this does is it sets us up to have a conversation about what we should do and shouldn't do next. And knowing that we've already invested millions of dollars into what's happening now, and what our capacity is for doing more, knowing that winter is coming, and knowing that we need to have that conversation now. And so I think that's part of what I wanted to just say, and also that that the status of things like outreach. And that would probably be a good thing to make sure everyone's aware of, like, where is that now? When do we think that's actually going to begin? And then the status of these housing units and what's likely to happen over the next week, month, so on. Because as we think about investing more resources into moving people from where they are now to another location, to a sanctioned camp, what's our financial capacity to do that? What's our capacity just in general? And how will that work impact our ability to really focus on winter and do that right? So I think that I think is the point for me of this presentation you just made. And I'm curious if others, if that added the same on them, and if it's worthy of having that conversation briefly to just make sure we're all on the same page with that before we go into really digging into this resolution, figuring out what this means and whether this is the right direction or not. So thank you.
So just briefly, there's reporters setting up, that's an exit way. We need to keep that path clear. I'm not sure exactly where you could set up, but not in a walkway, maybe over here by the picture on the wall. Ms. Brawley.
Sorry, I
okay,
missed
Mr.
one piece.
Go ahead.
One last piece that you said that I think for me really was important is that when these committees were set up, when the clean slate began, which was an opportunity to really say, okay, let's hold on for a second. Let's take a step back and look at what's out there and what's possible, and let's really plan in a thoughtful way. And I really appreciate that work. And then these two committees were set up. From my perspective, these two committees were set up again from a planning perspective. These are two potential areas that we really need to think about and do it right. If we're going to have sanctioned camps or not, and how we do it and where we do it and what that looks like. And so from my perspective, it was a surprise that it moved so fast, and I think that those who were involved in it, it wasn't a surprise because you were involved in it. You were heavily involved in it. But I think from other members of the community, it moved really quick. And so that's the other piece, is the expectation around those, from my perspective, was that those were long-term planning committees and not action committees that were going to happen within a few weeks. So thank you. That's it.
I think they were called task forces, but that's okay. It's semantics. Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. And Cameron, I appreciate you bringing that up. So it did land with me, and it's part of the reason why I've been involved in these discussions. And I think the other piece, so I want to put another factor on the table that I didn't see in the presentation, which is that the city is now engaging in abatement. So it is on a limited basis. It is in, as far as we know, one location. And I know that this is not a Q&A for the administration, but I do have a question for Alexis, which is, at this time, does the administration have other plans for abatement, either other time periods or other locations?
Yeah, through the chair to Ms. Brawley, thank you for the question. So the only current abatement that we have planned is the Cuddy Park and the old archive site. There has been communication between Parks and Rec and J-Bear, where they have asked what the plan is for that location at Davis. I believe it was spoken about yesterday at the Sanction Camp Task Force by Director Braniff, and I can get more information for you with that. But that is leased land that the municipality leases from J-Bear, and they have started conversations about that parcel of land. But we do not have a planned date or if and when that is occurring at this time.
And I'm just going to jump in there and say we're still waiting for delivery of policy from the legal department on how, why, where, when, and what's happening. And so I think that it's germane to the conversation, but not in detail because we don't have the facts yet.
And if I could just follow up. Yeah. So thank you for that information. And I bring that up. Again, this is not a conversation about abatement, but it is the other factor to consider, which is that we have folks who legally are not allowed to be on public land right now. And then our options are to affirmatively choose places that we are advising people to go, and then what that looks like potentially, or we are putting a situation where we don't give any of that guidance. And so it's pretty much up to either the administration to act if they choose to, or private landowners to trespass people. Thank you.
Anyone else? So I think Mr. Presverdia's question was, do we have kind of a sense of what was just presented to us, and are we grasping what was laid on the table? And it's a big mouthful there. And so I guess we'll follow the train that you have set up. And I will say, just as a matter of editorial, my question was my question before the task forces started was the threshold question: should we be engaging in the process of creating sanctioned camps or not? And I am interested to understand how the committee or the task force worked around that question, what the process was, and what the outcome of that conversation was.
Wonderful, thanks.
Mr. Salt. Okay.
So I just Mr. Padilla's question. I get what you're saying, you know, the sanction camping is recognizing where they're at, providing basic resources. But what resonated with me is really what Bill said, is I'm keenly focused on what we're gonna do this winter. It's gonna be here before we know it. And as you mentioned, it takes time to get these sanction camps up and running. We're kind of out of time. We'll probably have them established for, you know, by the time it's July, August, which would be a great plan to implement for next summer when it comes around and we cut our teeth. But really, I want to see us focus more on what the plan is for this winter before it's too late. Thank you.
So I also see that Mr. Myers was in the queue. You're still in the queue. Or maybe, okay. That would. Okay, thank you. And maybe that was an earlier note. Mr. Rivera.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to take a minute to address, and thanks everyone for all of that great commentary, to address some of the questions and comments brought up before I move on to the next part of the presentation. So with regards to outreach, outreach is currently ongoing. It's just not the expanded outreach that the Assembly funded hasn't quite started yet. And I think the hope is that that expanded outreach that we funded in first quarter budget revisions will be starting relatively soon. I don't think there's a representative from the coalition here who can speak to that specifically. But the previous outreach that we funded, whenever that was last year in 2022, those funds are still being used, as I understand it, for the current outreach that's happening. So we have the pop-ups that are happening, the coalition does, and other outreach to camps. In terms of the housing units and sort of when those are coming online, yeah, I think, you know, as the Anchorage Affordable Housing and Land Trust has stated, you know, their goal for the Barrett the former Barrett Inn is June, July timeframe. They really can't give any more refined time frame than that because it's construction and all of those factors. And then for the Golden Lion, that is the Assembly's goal per the first quarter budget revision amendment that was approved, is end of this month. And I hope that we're still on a guide path to get it open by the end of this month. And then the third option that comprises the other part of that 203 units that I mentioned is the former Lake House Inn, currently Lake Shore Inn, currently Lake House Inn. And those units are up online. That's 45 units. Approximately 20 of those units are being utilized. But as I sort of alluded to earlier, it is taking a little while for full utilization of those units, and something that I am looking at exploring to see what are the roadblocks and impediments to utilizing those units and what we can do to make it quicker, because we want those units to be used. We want people to move from either a sheltered or an unsheltered posture to a housed posture. That is our goal. So definitely looking forward to continuing work on that. With regard to financial capacity, I'm going to speak to that a little bit in the second half of the presentation. With regard to planning for task forces, I think the task force, when we get to it at the end, I'm hoping one of the members will that are here, so thanks to the task force members sitting at the table, will speak to the immediate needs and why that really came up, and why the resolution that we're seeing, that we have before us today, was created. And then I would also sort of caution that these task forces really are focused as much as possible on actions that can be taken and less so planning. So both task forces, facilitators, conveners, assembly leads are really focused on action. And then also on the threshold question of should we or not, I look forward to the task force members who are here talking to that specific question after we're done. And then last, on winter, as folks will see when we go through the presentation and in the resolution, some of these options, particularly when it comes to like pallet shelters or tiny homes or the relocatables, as feasible, are envisioned for year round. So, the work that is done here with sanctioned camps could be part of the emergency cold weather solution. With that, we're going to go ahead and move forward to the next slide. All right. So I'm not going to go through, all right. So I'm not going to go through these slides in detail, but this slide and the next two are from the AM that accompanied the sanctioned camp resolution and details a lot of the outreach and work that has been done from inception to the date that the AM was written. Next slide, please. I think it's included in here. Maybe not. No, it's not. But you all got it already. And next slide, please. All right, so now to the main attraction, and next slide, please. There we go. So I'm not going to spend much time on the whereas clause, except for two of them on this slide, and actually one of them is probably going to cause a lot of discussion later once we're done. So this first whereas that's mentioned here, so it is my position, and up until very recently, there was not any disagreement with this position, but it appears that now there is some legal ambiguity that sanctioned camps are not shelter and thus will have no impact on decisions made by the municipality on abatement. For me, that's particularly critical. And everyone probably saw in their emails earlier today a series of amendments proposed by a couple of the task force members to the resolution dealing with this specific issue. And then the last whereas, which basically says that the work isn't done yet, that these are preliminary recommendations, their immediate needs recommendations, and the task force felt it was critical to send those to us as the policymakers to consider as soon as possible. And I'm sure task force members will speak to that once we're done. Next slide, please. So I crafted section 1 a very specific way for a reason. You'll notice that the language talks about at some or all and based on feasibility. So I crafted this language to give the administration the flexibility, assuming this resolution gets passed, with sections 10 through 14 intact. Also, as we're going through this, I would invite folks to look at the S version. So this version doesn't have markups on it. It was a clerical error, but the S version does have the markups on it, so you can see the difference. So I crafted this language to give the administration the flexibility, assuming this resolution gets passed with sections 10 through 14 intact, to come back to the assembly and say that only one or two of the camps are feasible, or that all of them are feasible, or that none of them, although that is not my expectation. So when we get to debate on Tuesday, we can comb over each section that talks about a specific site and spend a lot of time debating it and amending it or leaving it up to the administration to do that legwork and report back to us. That is up to the will of this body. I want to be clear, though, about my expectation. And my expectation, if the assembly approves of this resolution, is that at least 2 campsites that are in this resolution be put forward as feasible, and preferably the campsites that have longer term utility be put forward as feasible, because I think that makes the most sense for any spending that we do on sanctioned camps. The second half of section 1 is deleted, which refers to the old section 15. And when we get there, you'll see that the new section 15 has changed drastically. On section 2, even though this is late in the process and doesn't bind us to whatever information the community councils give us, the task force did want to engage with the councils and ask they give us their preferred location for both sanctioned camp and or emergency shelter. And we're going to be engaging in a lot of that emergency shelter conversation later today and forever. The date on this section is changed and amended to account for the delay in taking up this resolution. Next slide, please. So on section 3, this is what I call the minimum standards section. So you'll notice the words practical and feasible. I think these standards are going to depend a lot on the location. And although there isn't a detailed plan on a lot of this list, that's going to be coming hopefully with the July 6th report. The task force did at least want to put pen to paper on some standards to consider. Next slide, please. Here are the rest of those standards that are in section 3. Section 4 deals with the Anchorage School District relocatable buildings. And as you'll see in sections 10 through 14, there is a plan for usage of all of these buildings, assuming that's all feasible as planned. Next slide, please. So section 5 deals with the pallet shelters. Although 30 was the original number that was tossed around, some Assembly Member Soltz put that amendment forward, I believe, when we were doing the first quarter budget revision process to move forward with purchasing of 30. And that's what the task force initially was considering in its recommendations. The task force decided to up the ante a bit and increase that number to 90. And these have to be ordered in groups of 30, which is why it's 90 and not some other number in between 30 and 60 and 90. Section 6 is about tiny homes. So I included the Department of Corrections as they reached out to me directly about a program that they have to build tiny homes that could be turned on pretty quickly if we give them the green light. And then Habitat for Humanity was included at the suggestion of a task force member. And then quote unquote other interested parties includes labor unions and apprenticeship programs, which are currently building tiny homes every summer and dismantling them because they can't be used within the municipality, which to me was like, WTF, mate. Next slide, please. So section 7 really gets to what I was mentioning earlier, which is that we need to make sure that we are balancing the scales here. We have to ensure that there's adequate funding to deal with 2023-2024 emergency cold weather shelter and setting up a new permanent year-round low barrier shelter. So there's lots of competing priorities for a limited pool of funding. Section 8 was added at the request of a task force member. And actually a couple other task force members also have ideas pertaining specifically to this section and usage of vacant parking lots. And then section 9 deals with the process to secure providers. And especially the task force wanted to ensure that we didn't overwhelm any particular provider with managing a lot of different sanctioned camps. So that's why the provision is included in there that only 2 sanctioned camps per provider. Next slide, please. So this sections 10 through 14 are the specific locations. You'll notice that the starting dates are now uniform considering the delay in us taking up the resolution. So June 19th is the new starting date for all of these. June 19th assumes, and I haven't told anyone this, June 19th assumes that we have a special assembly meeting on June 13th to make the additional policy and funding decisions that I'm going to outline in another slide just an FYI. Because I know folks are curious about this and the selection of the locations happened through a group exercise that I led, considerations for the locations included things like proximity to buses, or can transportation be arranged, proximity to food, grocery stores, etc., or can be food be arranged, visibility and clear lines of sight, limitations on size dependent on location and neighboring impacts, infrastructure or the ability to provide that infrastructure on site, like utilities, etc. Mirroring regulations for marijuana or alcohol locations. That was something that was also brought up by that small group. And then additional considerations are in the meeting minutes, which all Assembly members received a while ago. So there's a variety of different considerations that the small group made when they met over the weekend, a couple weekends ago, when looking at these different sites. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to walk through each of the specifics because it's we can get to that if folks have questions in discussion. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So section 15 has changed to, frankly, make this more palatable and recognize the fact that the task force really didn't talk to the named organizations in advance, and this was seen as a negative surprise to some. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide details all of the various pieces that, if approved, will be follow-up actions based on this resolution. So we're all on the same page. This resolution isn't the end of the process, but really the first of several steps that need to be considered. And what I'm really hoping is trying to get, even though we don't take votes in work sessions, just trying to get a sense of the body in this work session, because most of these pieces haven't even really been started because I don't have the sense of this body. And so once I do get a sense of this body, that will be a guidepost for me on how much future energy to put on doing all of these other necessary steps. Next slide, please. So because I know folks are curious, the way I see it, there are 3 avenues for funding. Fund balance, which we know will be about $10 to $11 million. Unspent alcohol tax funds, which might be around the $4 million range. And last and probably least popular is reallocating funds. Next slide, please. And I guess just if we can go back. Again, I'll just keep rehashing as I have done. So, as I spattered out those numbers, just again, realize the competing priorities for those funds include the possibility of sanctioned camps, emergency cold weather shelter for 23, 24, and permanent year-round low beer shelter. Next slide, please. So the task force met yesterday, and these are amendments that the task force suggested to the resolution, and I think I have one more, so just give me a second. So I'm going to be working with council on creating floor amendments, possibly to address these, and if needed, to make it explicit that the establishment of the sanctioned camps will not lead to abatement is no longer if needed. Yeah, I believe it is needed at this point. And then the other amendment, I believe, that was discussed but didn't was around 1805 Academy and fine-tuning the physical description of that. And also, I think we're going to have a discussion probably soon about the utility of 1805 Academy or not. I think that is a continued discussion, specifically regarding the population description. It appears, I haven't had the full in-depth discussions yet, but it appears that that particular population, which was envisioned for 1805 Academy, which were the folks who were currently staying at the Sullivan at the time when this resolution was crafted, may no longer need 1805 Academy. So that's a further discussion and exploration that I need to do before Tuesday. And then we can maybe have some of that discussion here as well. Next slide, please. So regardless of what actions the Assembly takes on this resolution on June 6th, there's still a lot of work the task force has to accomplish. So this slide lays out all of the meetings that they have up until the deadline of July 6th to get the report on an Assembly agenda. So a lot of work that the task force is going to continue to do, and a lot of work that they have done. Next slide, please. All right, that is it. So Mr. Chair, I don't know if we want to start by hearing from some of the task force members or just incorporate that into the dialogue as things move on.
So who are you proposing to speak for the task force?
So we have several folks here who can respond to questions as needed, but perhaps one of the co-conveners, I don't know if both co-conveners are here. No, it sounds like just Sylvia right now. Okay, so maybe Sylvia, you can kick us off with some of your thoughts.
Well, thank you so much for listening to us today. The task force is made out of many community members who care about what's going to happen in our communities. Not only with the people that are less fortunate that do not have a place to live, but also their surrounding communities, their neighbors. So those are two components that were very and are very important to the task force. Every suggestion, every comment that each and every individual make is taken in, is listened to, and we definitely have discussion. The problem that we have here today is very simple, is take a look at our communities and what's happening out there. We have people everywhere. People sleeping in every cubby, little tents everywhere. It's really and truly disturbing to many of us, not only because it's not humane to have this happening in our Anchorage area, downtown with the tourists, and every corner of our city. The way that this is, and I had a little bit of a problem also myself understanding the components and steps we were going to take, but I do ask questions, right? So this is temporary with the hope that people will move on to a permanent solution, which is housing. We need to have people congregate in an area which they'll be safe, where the coalition can come and do their research and do their clinical treatments and intakes of whatever it is they can identify and define in order to get that person, whether it's they have behavioral health issues, actual physical issues, they can take them to where they need to go. Right now, they're scattered everywhere in our community. Another component to that is the police department. The police department is getting called everywhere. The communities, the Anchorage Safety Patrol, they're getting called everywhere. So now we're going to have specific areas where people can actually concentrate and help alleviate a lot of this confusion in running around. And this is what the task force is trying to do, help our community both ways. Thank you.
Not seeing any questions. I have two. Mr. Rivera suggested that you would be best to answer the question of what part of the conversation did the group have about whether or not we should do this, and what was their discussion and the outcome of it. And the second question is, now that we've heard that the intent of the sponsor and members of the community is that these can't be used as places where the city says you have to go there, you can't camp here. Meaning we have camps everywhere, but there's nothing in this resolution as drafted, especially if it's amended as proposed, that would provide law enforcement, the administration, any tool to say you can't be here. So is that what the task force contemplated, was we just set up places and people can go there if they want, but they can stay everywhere they want it, or where they're at now?
Mr. Constant, we spend many hours talking about this subject, and we don't want people scattered everywhere. And I'm going to let this young man here talk a little bit about some of the conversations that we had.
Please say your name.
My name is Charles Welch. Part of the conversation that we had and the intention of the task force was if we make them appealable enough, people will gravitate towards that because that's where the services are at. That's where they can go to charge their cell phone. That's where they can go and take a shower. So the appeal was that we would have it set up to where it would be appealing, or much more appealing for them there than in the woods, than in somebody's backyard.
No, I understand the philosophical arguments there. I just question the reality of it. I mean, they're pretty comfortable at Third Avenue right now. And I don't think anything's moving them off of Third Avenue except a force of law. And so we pick all 5 locations. Third Avenue is still going to be choice, close to town, close to stores, close to the crowds, close to the drugs, close to the food. So I don't know that putting in Wi-Fi is enough or electricity to move those folks or in any of these other locations. Interesting. So, but the first, I think I asked 2-part question, but I guess that's probably good enough for now, other than you said you talked about it for a long time.
Mr. Chair, we have talked about it quite a lot. And I'm very much aware of the situation, as you know, on Third Avenue. And I spoke to quite a few guys around there, and it keeps growing, right? It went from 40 now to almost 80, plus cars and campers, etc. We need to be able to give people the opportunity. You're either going to be moved out of here, sent to a good place where you can be safe, you can lock your belongings, because that's another thing that they're very afraid of is, when they move, they got to move everything or else it's stolen. It's just going to be a safer place for people to be at and to keep track of.
So, but nothing here would say you have to go there, you can't stay here. It's just the opposite. This says you can stay where you are and where you want to be. And we'll have some places that might have some additional supports. Anyone else? Okay, Ms. Brong and then Mr. Presverdia and then Ms. Broadley.
So that's also my sticking point, the whereas 13, that if we go to the expense and effort, and I first want to respect how much work you guys have done on this task force, and I appreciate that. But with this whereas added, that they could camp anywhere, because I know in Far North Bicentennial Park, that's abutting my area or part of my area, there's a lot of campers in there that are very happy with being along Campbell Creek. They've cut down all kinds of trees, made forts, and there's no fire suppression on the east side of town. It's all on South Anchorage for wildland fires. And I'm concerned that if we go to the expense of making these camps and they're attractive, those people that I see when I run the tour trail are very happy where they are, and I would like them to be more forcefully invited to a camping location that you've set up, that taxpayers are all funding. My other sticking point on this is Centennial Park and the Reeve Boulevard. Any of these sanctioned camp areas that are directly in the midst of forest, it's a wildland fire hazard waiting to happen. I think orderly camps where line of sight is readily, we can see every tent, they're numbered, we know who's in those, is the only thing that I can see as being safe for the neighbors around those immediate areas. Also with the wildlife in the Centennial Park. And then the Centennial Park, the other thing that comes to mind is a lot of people coming to visit Anchorage, that's the first place they happen on to camp is, they pulled their RV up here. Do we want that to be the first impression of Anchorage? Is a lot, I guess last year, people who were camp up here visiting could still camp in Centennial Park, but it's not very good optics. Your first camping trip is you find out you're in the middle of a sanctioned homeless camp. And the residents of Muldoon, I know we have security on here, but I imagine we had security around Sullivan Arena because I heard about drug deals in the parking lot and the trash and how the neighbors were impacted. How is this different? What is the difference in security for these camps that wasn't there for Sullivan? Because I guarantee the Fairview neighbors would tell you that they weren't happy with how things looked.
Mr. Rivera, I don't know that these are good questions for the task force for you or what. So I want you to be careful in kind of making sure the right person is answering.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I'm happy to shoulder some of these questions as well and work with task force members on it. So, I think one of the important aspects to remember is that regardless of whether we move forward with all of the proposed suggestions in this resolution, there is still going to be an unsheltered population in our community, right? And it is my posture that we should not force individuals to go into a sanctioned camp. Rather, we have funded extensive outreach, right? Outreach can go talk to folks and go let them know that there is a better alternative. And the most we can do is cajole, ask, in my perspective. But as soon as we start getting into trying to force individuals, I just think that crosses a line that for me, I cannot support. That said, in the end, I think it is a policy decision of the municipality and of the assembly, because I believe, just based off of some legal descriptions that I've heard from Assembly Council, that sanctioned camps could be treated as quote unquote shelter and could be used to force abatement. But again, I will repeat my previous statement that I think that personally would be a travesty if we did that. And I don't remember your other question. I think it was around security. Yeah. So with specifically around security, I think one of the things that we need to really make sure that we do is adequately fund and plan for security at these locations. So with Sullivan Arena, we funded security at Sullivan Arena, but it took something like 2 or 3 months before that funding actually got implemented. And I think once it was implemented, maybe it got a little bit better, but there were still issues, right? Okay, thank you. So the chair is saying it didn't get better. So thanks. I think what we need to do with security is really ensure that, one, I think some type of fencing for some of these locations, and particularly, when I think of fencing, I'm thinking sort of nicer wooden fencing rather than chain link fencing, right? I think fencing is important for the people inside and for the people outside, but I think most importantly for the people inside, because I think what often happens is folks inside are victimized, right? And I think fencing and points of entry would be a good way to avoid victimizing and providing adequate security for the folks inside. And then I think just having an operator on board who works with the population and develops policies. I think one of the things in here is good neighbor policy, which I know that term is thrown around a lot and folks probably aren't happy with that term, but the provider will work and develop a good neighbor policy with adjacent community councils. Yeah, that's in there in section 3. So I think that's important to at least develop that relationship between the provider and the community councils, and really be action and mitigation oriented, and work with the provider to do that.
Please, Ms. Villamidis.
Thank you. So if you notice, the camps are smaller population. Sullivan Arena would not compare. I mean, Sullivan Arena, I was there, it was chaos, uncontrollable. This is more smaller. Again, the task force has recommended that any provider does not be allowed to manage more than 2 camps so that they can have more control of what's happening. Mr. Felix Rivera just talked about neighbor policies. I know that, and I'm the president of the Downtown Community Council, and I do know that I have quite a few of those through our community, and they work. Collaboration between neighbors is the best way to do things. And representation at the community council meetings from both sides. So that there is a problem, let's try to talk about it so we can resolve it before it evolves to something bigger. That's all I have, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Any follow-up? Ms. Brawley, no, okay. Ms. Bronco, Ms. Brawley? Oh, go ahead.
We didn't talk about the forested versus like open spaced fields or parking lot and the decisions for the locations based on that.
So I think by and large, the locations that are selected here are all municipally owned locations. And so that's why you probably see vacant land or land that might be in wooded areas. I think there's one there's a couple that aren't in wooded areas, but I think the other ones may or may not be in wooded or semi-wooded areas. But that was the limiting factor that we had, is if we're going to do anything in the immediate term, it has to be municipally owned, and a lot of those are just in vacant lands that may be in wooded areas. Sections 8 and I believe Section 15 deals with other lands, whether that's parking lots or other vacant lands that might be non-municipally owned, but that is a much lengthier process, and there is no, might be lengthier, might not be lengthier, but there is no way to know if that's going to be successful or not, because the landowners may easily say, heck no, I'm not interested in that.
All right, now Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. First, a brief statement and then a question for the task force folks. I think the question that we have to wrestle with, the assembly and the administration and the community, is how do we make our current situation less bad? That's the frame that I've been looking at through this. So, and I'm not arguing, we're not debating the resolution. I understand that. I just want to put that question on the table and make it very clear. That is the question we all have to ask ourselves, which could be a no action scenario, which could be choosing to do nothing, right? Or to continue what we have now, which is nothing. The question I have for the task force folks, and Charlie, I can't remember what district you live in, but I was curious. So I'm looking at this resolution. I see that 5 of the 6 districts have at least one location proposed. There isn't one proposed for District 2, which is Eagle River and Chugiak area. But I wanted to just get some discussion from you guys or feedback on the conversations that you had about distribution of locations. So not these individual locations, but kind of the decision process that you went through and why, for why there's not just one location or one district worth of locations. Thank you.
Please state your name before you speak. Thanks.
Roger Branson, community member of the task force. We leading into the exercise when we talked about location, the topic of different districts and having a suggested site for each one did come out of the task force. That was something that Felix led, and I think that's how we ended up with just 5 districts. I'm not sure if that was a question.
Yeah, just to clarify, not so much. I only brought up District 2 not being there just to mention that it isn't there, but just generally the idea of having a distributed set of locations, basically.
Yeah, that was one of the metrics we looked at in suggesting, something from each district, and towards the end, that was how we came down to Viking being the suggestion for Mountain View.
And if I may add, so one of the, so when the assembly created the task force, we put some guiding parameters for them. And one of the guiding parameters was that the task force shall comply with a resolution, which the assembly passed in 2018. and reaffirmed earlier this year. And that resolution says two things. One, that there will be dispersed placement of these types of services, and that two, before looking at Fairview and downtown, we must look everywhere else. So I think that is one of the guiding principles that we said the task force, as an assembly, the task force shall follow that guiding principle. And I think that's what led to the larger discussion.
Thanks.
Anything else, Ms. Brawley? Okay, Mr. President, and then after that, Mr. Salt.
Thank you. I do want to first say before I go through my statement, and I think there may be a question there, but it's probably just mostly me talking. To thank you all for your time and the work that you've done. I really think it's valuable, and I actually think that the work that you've done will be valuable regardless whether this goes into place right now or not. Because I think, and you and I've had conversations about the fact that sanctioned camps is something this city needs to talk about. It needs to be thinking about, and whether those exist here or not, and how those fit into the continuum of care, how those fit into the process of trying to move people into housing and all of that. So I think that that's really important, and I think you've done a lot of really great work here. There's so many barriers at this point. I mean, one of the things I think about is just the role of the assembly. The role of the assembly is to allocate resources and develop policy and to convene. But the administration has already come out clearly and said, we're not going to do this. No, the answer is no. At the last assembly meeting, they said, no, we're not going to do this. So that's a big challenge because they're the ones that would have to do it. We can't, as assembly members, go and do it. The coalition has essentially said it's not a very good idea, and I know that they haven't put that on the record, but they've essentially not weighed in here because their position, and I don't want to speak for them, but is we're going to do massive outreach. We put $1 million into outreach. We're currently doing outreach. We're working on getting housing going. And let's get that going. Let's do pop-ups. Let's get people into housing. Let's do everything we can to get bathrooms and medical and food to people where they are now, where they've chosen to be. Let's keep people as safe as we possibly can. Let's get as many people into services and housing this summer. And then let's figure out a plan for continuing to get them into housing and for what we're going to do for winter. So that's one of my challenges here is that even if we said yes, and then Mr. Rivera is talking about the fact that it's taking months to do anything, and talking about getting operators and developing policy and developing good neighbor policies. All of these things with this administration at this time, these are months and months out. And so I don't see how it's possible in our current scenario that unless someone else takes over the city, unless a new administration comes in tomorrow, I'm not sure I see any of this going on. And so that's what makes me frustrated is that even if we try to do it, I'm not sure it would happen. But there's a whole bunch here that I think is really a challenge, and that is that right now the way I see it is that we made the choice, right or wrong, to end the Sullivan. And so, and people are all over, but there are people that have congregated in large areas, and services are going to those areas now. And I guess I'm trying to figure out if we were to go through the process, and by some miracle, the administration actually does this and actually sets up sanctioned camps and actually gets operators and provides all of the services that we say that we're going to do here. In the next month, and when we do that, will people go? Will people move? I think some will, but some will stay exactly where they are. And so, have we continued to disperse for the police and for services? So it's tough because I think that and then the comment that earlier about if we continue to do nothing. I don't think we're doing nothing. Actually, as a city, just in the 4 years that I've been on the assembly, there's more that's being done than ever before. It's not enough by any means, but I'm trying to figure out what's realistic and what we can actually get done in this summer. So that's the challenge that I have, is that I think that a lot of this work that you've done sets the groundwork for a really important conversation coming of whether we should have sanctioned camps here or not. I don't think it actually is realistic that it'll happen this summer, for all of the reasons that I laid out. And so that may sound like I'm talking out to two sides of my mouth, but I want to thank you for your work. And I also want to say that I just want to be honest, is that I don't see that it's possible. And so I want to go back to what Ms. Brawley said. What can we do right now to keep people as safe as we can, to keep people and to get people into services and get people in and into housing? And so my perspective is that we need to make sure that we're focusing on that. And that means outreach, that means housing, that means food, medical, whatever we can. If we need to increase the number of pop-ups, let's do it. But a massive creation of new areas this summer seems really, really challenging to me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Sylvia.
Thank you so much for your feedback. There was a lot of ifs in your statement, and to do nothing is not acceptable for our communities. Every district in the city of Anchorage is hurting one way or another. We are seeing people everywhere that we cannot help. And to do nothing, I don't think that's acceptable. With all respect, we need to do something in order to take care of the situation now. I have been in this community for over 30 years, working on the same issues. Meeting after meeting, paper after paper, stacked up somewhere. Cannot happen anymore, sir. We need to do something positive for our community. Thank you.
I'd like to respond. And where's the mayor? Where is he? Has he been at any meeting? Any of our meetings? Any committee meetings? Any homeless and services meeting? Where is he? Does he exist? Because I haven't seen him. So my concern is that I agree with every single thing you said. I was born and raised in this state. I've lived here my entire life. I've seen this happen for decades. So we do need to do something. And I want to do something. I want to make sure we're doing things in a way that works and is meaningful. So again, I thank you for your work, and I thank you for your time and for your passion. This city needs administration to actually do something. Unfortunately, we as an assembly are really limited in what we can do. So we can pass this, and if that feels like we're doing something, if that feels like that we are taking action, but my experience over the last 4 years is that we can only pass it, but then someone has to actually put it into place. So, and I apologize for that, but again, thank you for your time and
I'm
thank you
going
for
to
your work.
note Mr. Cross arrived in the room. He was on the phone a little bit early. I didn't see when he joined. And I have a couple more people in the queue. So Mr. Salt.
Okay, I'll try to be brief.
I don't know who would like to tackle that. Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And may I get the latitude to just respond briefly to some previous comments?
You have the floor.
Thank you. Okay, so before I get to your comments, Mr. Salt, to Mr. Perez Verdia, I appreciate your comments. And I think if you had attended any of the Sanctioned Camp Community Task Force meetings, you will know that those meetings were very charged, very emotional, but a lot of great work was done in those meetings. So specific to sort of where people are choosing to be, the task force, one of the exercises it did pretty early on before it even talked about immediate needs recommendations was the 4 sites where people are choosing to be are those sites that are good for those individuals who are staying there, good for the neighbors or not. So those 4 sites that we looked at are 3rd Ave, the Old Alaska Native Hospital site, the Chester Creek site, the Mountain View Snow Dump site, and then the Cuddy Park adjacent site. The task force during its deliberation came to the conclusion that of those 4, really 3 of them probably really aren't suited to adequately be used as whether unsanctioned encampments or sanctioned encampments. Those 3 being the Old Alaska Native Hospital site, Chester Creek site, and the Mountain View Snow Dump. There was thought that maybe the Cuddy Park adjacent site would actually work, right? So the task force did do some work into that. With regard to the nothing comment that Ms. Brawley made, I just want to point folks back, and if we can go ahead and go to slide 10, please, of the presentation. I think that really encapsulates the nothing comment, right? Which is planning scenario A, which is nothing with regard to sanctioned camps. We know we're going to have housing coming online, but that's about it. There's nothing else going on this summer. So that's about 450 individuals, right? That are going to be remaining in an unsanctioned situation if we do nothing. Then there's do something to the maximum, which is 150 individuals that are going to remain unsanctioned. Now, I said this earlier, and I'll repeat this. There's the maximum, and then there's the lever of where we want to go from nothing to the maximum, right? So I would highly suggest, as we consider this, that we don't throw all of this out, that instead we look at what actually Mr. Soltz called, I believe it was at an assembly meeting when he put forward the amendment for the 30 pallet shelters, a pilot project, right? And I do believe that there is actually a lot of potential with the pilot shelters in 1 or 2 locations as a pilot project. And so I would really caution the body to really, rather than think about an all or nothing approach, that there's something in the middle we can consider. With regard to Mr. Salt's comment, so the 1805 Academy Drive location was considered for, when it was put on the list, it was considered to transition folks who were currently staying at the Sullivan, who are folks who are disabled, medical conditions, those kinds of, that population, transitioning those folks from the Sullivan seamlessly to the 1805 Academy. And was initially thought of as for 20 to 40 individuals. In the end, the last day at the Sullivan, there were 37 individuals who were at the Sullivan the very last day. So that population estimate was pretty spot on. Now we know that the individuals who are staying at the Sullivan, staying at the Sullivan, actually were successful with achieving mostly. I think maybe 5 chose to go camping, but the remainder were successful with achieving some other positive outcome. So I think, one of the questions that we need to delve into, one of the policy decisions we need to delve into is, well, now that that population we were envisioning for 1805 Academy no longer exists, do we still want to keep that particular location on the list? Do we want to put another specific population that's small, again, that 20 to 40 at 1805 Academy? What does that look like? I think those are all policy considerations for us as we deliberate this on June 6th. And it's certainly dialogue that over the weekend I'm going to be having with individuals to better fine tune. This was, as we all know, sort of very recent actions. And so I'm not fully prepared to discuss that today, but certainly by Tuesday, hope to have a better fleshed out idea of 1805 Academy.
Please state your name.
My name is Charles Welch, and just as a matter of correction, Felix, we were discussing the Viking Drive, not the Mountain View Snow Dump. The snow dump is leased from J Bear by the city. Okay, so the Viking Drive one is the one that you had been discussing about in Mountain View, I believe.
Yeah, thanks. So just a little bit of clarification, right? So we had talked about, do we want to sanction the snow dump site or not? And the decision was not. And then if that is, and where are people going to go? Then that's when we came to the Viking Drive discussion.
Briefly, and please state your name for the record. You had your hand up.
Yeah, hello, my name's Tony J. Andrew. I'm a community member and volunteering for the task force. I'd just like to make a quick comment. I first sat in a meeting in 2009. It's taken 14 years to get to this point. I want to thank Felix Rivera for chairing this Sanctioned Camp Task Force. I really believe there's been a spark in our community to help the less fortunate. And that is why I'm volunteered on this task force. I heard stories of not very good stories about women, women being raped in the camps. And I really believe at the very minimum, I recommend at the very minimum 2 sanctioned camp areas to help keep the less fortunate in our community safe. We've tried to balance these locations throughout the municipality. I believe we may have quickly made decisions because of the Sullivan Arena closure on May 31st. But, you know, my main focus is keeping our women and families safe, those that are homeless. So I want to encourage each of our assembly, the mayor, our whole community to approve a minimum of 2 sanctioned camp locations. These are temporary camp locations. They will be safe areas. The community organizations, they're already there helping. And I see no problem with the Salvation Army as an example, but there are various organizations out there already helping our less fortunate. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. And the queue still, and I'm sorry for the delay, Mr. Johnson and then Ms. Brawley.
No, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think in terms of how I frame this, it's similar to Ms. Brawley and accepting that we will not come up to a perfect solution, but less bad is still less bad than the status quo. And when I look at the planning scenarios A and B, A to me, where we essentially do nothing, seems undesirable. And I think option B, wherein we do everything, seems probably not feasible in terms of our limited resources with time and money. But with that, I sincerely hope, and there is a question here, but I sincerely hope that we do at least on some scale move forward with implementing sanctioned camping this summer. I think the task force has done very impressive work. And I have tremendous amount of respect for the people who have put their time and energy into it. And having been to most of the task force meetings, it's brought together a lot of perspectives, including lived perspectives that I don't think have often been part of the conversation. It's been very informative. And part of my concern is if we don't take some measure of action based on these recommendations, then we're going to lose that effort. We're going to lose some of that knowledge. And so in my mind, recognizing that camping is going to be part of the solution, whether we like it or not, probably for years to come. I don't think anybody here can realistically put forward a scenario wherein we have adequate shelter bandwidth next year to where we are able to completely do away with camping. I mean, I think we'd love to get there eventually, but it's going to be part of the conversation for now. So how do we make it how do we mitigate the harms both to the people in the camps and the communities as well as we can? And I think moving forward, even in a limited capacity, is a step in the right direction in that regard. So the question I have today, really in my mind, and it's rhetorical at this point, but I do think we need to answer it sooner than later. Really, what is feasible? I mean, what resources do we have to deploy towards this project? Recognize at some point we're going to bump into an opportunity cost, wherein we're taken away from our ability to deal with the, I would say, more necessary step of coming up with emergency cold weather shelter and year-round shelter. So what can we put towards this? And then once we answer that question, determine what is the best use of those resources. And I hope that we can answer those questions in time to actually do something this summer, both in terms of taking advantage of the work that's been done and also, even if it's imperfect, lessening the harms that we're seeing today.
Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Member Rivera, for bringing this slide back up. I think it's a helpful framing. I just want to clarify to my comment about doing nothing, because I don't want to make it sound like the municipality is doing nothing or that the community is. I think Felix ran through the housing projects that were funded by this body in the last couple of years that are coming online. It takes time and they will not serve everybody, but that is something. The shelters that we do have operating in this community, that is something. And the outreach that we're doing to connect folks with housing and services, that is something. But I think, again, the reality is that none of that will solve the problem right now. It needs to happen. And so what we are talking about is also what we do right now. And I think to Mr. Johnson's point, yeah, it is going to take time. And yeah, the question is what is feasible right now? Thank you.
Mr. President.
Is there someone from the Coalition to End Homelessness here today? Is there any representative from the coalition here? No. Okay. So I guess my question is to Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson, if this plan was approved, will the administration move forward and implement this program as it's designed this summer?
Through the chair to Mr. Perez-Verdia, thank you so much for the question. I'm glad I got an opportunity to answer. I'll be candid with you. We do not have the financial backing, and as great as these ideas are and the hours that this task force has spent, which I believe we could possibly roll into next summer, I personally do not believe that we will be able to stand up 5 Cadillac planned sanctioned camps with the resources that we have with no financial plan by the date that's being asked of us. I will tell you, if you're going to bet on anyone to get it done, it would be me and my team. And Michael can attest to that. They're the hardest working team and in the municipality, I bet. But it's just not feasible. And so now we're placed in a situation, and thank you for the caveat, Felix, in the resolution that says the administration should move forward with any camps that are feasible. Now the administration will be placed in a situation where we have to choose between 1 or 2 of 5 locations, and that neighborhood or community is going to feel like they're being targeted by this administration. And that's not where I come from. That's not equitable. That's not fair. And I think it's going to be very difficult for this administration, especially my division and my department, to stand up 5 sanction camps with no money outlined to find 5 operators that we know the workforce and labor market in this town is very scarce. I really continue to say we need to focus on cold weather, because I wonder what population this resolution serves. Because if it's not the taxpayers of this city to allow for certain specific locations in this town, we can't abate other locations into these sanctioned camps. So the complaints that we hear, they're on our trails, they're in our parks, those aren't going to be cleaned up with this resolution. It does not solve that problem. And on the other swing of things, we just funded $1.1 million. Thank you so much to the coalition for outreach dollars. Those are where the services are being met with the campers out on the streets right now. This plan, although great for next summer, I appreciate the work. I am so very grateful. There is no funding, there's no benefit, in my opinion, to standing up these camps if people are not going to leave where they're already at. And that's a hard pill to swallow and to say out loud. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm disappointed there's not anybody from the coalition here, because I think part of what you're saying is that right now, where people are, services are being provided. Bathrooms are being brought to where they are now. Medical services, to the degree that's possible, are being provided. Food is being provided. And once this $1.1 million goes into place, that is going to be boosted up significantly. So people are going out and trying to address people's needs to the degree possible. It's not ideal. And so I guess that's where I was coming from. My last statement is, what's feasible? What can we do this year? And what can we do this summer to keep people safe and get people the services that they need while we focus on winter? So thank you for your time. And I don't, the piece that I think is missing here, and I think this is what is challenging, is that I think sanctioned camps should be a part of our services here in the city. I have thought that for a long, long time. And I think that we need to make sure that we're doing that with all partners here. And so to have the coalition not here as a part of this conversation is difficult, because they have been leading and coordinating a lot of these efforts over the last few years. And so that missing voice makes it hard for me. Thank you.
So I have myself in the queue, and I have just a whole bunch of things. Go ahead.
Just to be quick with you, Mr. Perez-Verdia, the initial $700,000 grant to the coalition is underway. That grant is executed. They're doing work. Solomedics is there. I believe Rural Cap is working for case management there. They're doing their pop-up events. The $1.1 million, they have to increase their staffing levels for these outreach. That is underway. We're finishing up the amendment at the Anchorage Health Department, but we let them know that they can start staffing and buying and accumulating resources for that. So it is underway.
And the shower and toilet truck is on the way up, and there's all kinds of things in motion. I have myself, then Mr. Martinez, Mr. Cross, and I'm going to be brief because these two haven't spoken. But to say, I just saw the addendum, and there is now even an ordinance that contemplates creating sanctioned camps. And so now we have a resolution that creates sanctioned camps and an ordinance that does the same thing. The matter is now even more confused. And I have a lot of questions. I'm going to hold my questions until after you gentlemen go, and it's getting grayer by the minute. Mr. Martinez.
Grayer with respect to the sky or your beard?
Both, and the potential outcomes.
Thank you. There's a few points and a question along the way. It was said earlier before, Member Rivera, you mentioned in the presentation that sanctioned camps can take a lot of different forms. But then we also talked about a pilot project. And one of the pilot projects referred to pallets. And it would seem that, to the point of the site selection, that not every site would be amenable to pallet design or implementation. So necessarily, we're talking about selecting, if we're going to do a pilot, a target site that would not necessarily be equitable just by definition of a pilot. So I just wanted to put that really clear. But what I think is important is that we understand in my mind a theory of change that requires giving people something to see and believe in. So I think it's important that we have definitions, we have guidelines, but also if we're going to move forward with a pilot project that, and when these conversations started, that we have a picture in our minds that we can communicate to the public. So on that front, I would just ask, I think it was, when was the first time that sanctioned camps were recommended as a possible strategy? If anyone from the task force administration can answer that, that may help me with my next part.
2018, maybe
Yeah.
2017. Yeah.
It's been talked about historically. The administration, I believe, brought it forward last summer when we had conversations about Centennial, but more formally on February 15th for the Housing and Homeless Committee.
Thank
And
you.
then whenever the task force was created.
So I just wanted to flag that as a challenge to recognize that, in my mind, saying that we're too late to bite at that apple when the design or the conversation started a while ago is a little out of step with, in my mind, with respect to having deciding to take no action. And I just wanted to put a little finer point on it. I didn't hear anything in this conversation today from the task force. Thank you all, task force members. Thank you for stepping up. Thank you for your perspectives. But I did not hear Cadillac scenarios. So I know that wasn't maybe an artful term, but I don't think we're talking about setting up Cadillac responses at all. I think we're talking about a humanitarian response to a situation that is currently not humane in our community. So I just thank you for bringing me into when this conversation started. I think there's the ability to move forward with at least giving people something to believe in if we're going to do something at all. And that would be my last comment on that. Thank you.
Mr. Cross.
Yes, thank you. You know, I really do appreciate the work and the conversation the Sanctioned Camp Task Force has put together, but I am also have the same concerns with time. I'm just looking at the calendar and I'm looking outside, and in 18 days, it's going to start getting darker. And my fear is that by the time we get around to identifying and going through the process and getting it, we're going to erect these camps only to have to take them back down a couple of weeks later. And that is not just a wasted effort on our part, but think about the individuals who get picked up and moved, and now they got to move again. And what does that look like? And so, in order to resolve this problem. So I like the conversation that's come out of it. I think there needs to be a standard to what a sanctioned camp needs to look like, so the public and everybody has a realization, some sort of building standard or something that applies that, so people can get their heads around it, so they're not instant reaction isn't fear. I don't think it's going to happen this summer just looking at a calendar. Listen, I've run construction projects, and I'm like, we don't even agree on what it looks like yet or what those sites might or might not be. And we've got 90 days. It's 60 days for purchasing. So this is great. I would really love for us to slow roll this a little bit more and realize that bringing services to the individuals where they're already camping, and helping them with outreach is probably the fastest and bestest way we can, so that we don't uproot them, put them somewhere, and then uproot them and put them somewhere else. And by the time we get them erected, or give false hope or realities that this is going to happen and it doesn't, and we really start focusing on the cold weather, which most definitely is coming. And I don't know if you've noticed, my fear is it's coming a lot sooner than any of us are used to. We're in June and it's only hit 60 degrees once or twice so far. What happens with this other weather anomaly we have where winter is happening in beginning or middle of October? And here we are worrying about summer camps, and we haven't even worried about winter coldness, and we know that's approaching. So that's my thoughts on this. Let's focus on the cold weather and some definitive housing and shelter. I feel as if more emphasis on that and less on sanctioned camps, and we can deal with this and develop a well plan that can be implemented next year, is a much more useful direction of our time and efforts. Thank you.
Mr. Presverdia, then Mr. Martinez.
Thank you. Two questions for Mr. Rivera. First, did you consider that the last sanction camp that the administration put forward? Okay. Do you believe the last administrative created camp that was done was effective and worked?
Thanks. So, as I was saying, no, I do not believe that what the administration stood up was a sanctioned camp, nor was it a homelessness response. And they admitted that, right? They refused to call it a homelessness response. And by and large, no, I do not think it was effective. I think it incrementally got better, but even then wasn't ideal throughout its implementation.
So I'm understanding that your vision of this is different than that. Is that correct?
100%.
Okay. And then the second is that through the process, and I appreciate you pointing out that I had not attended any of the meetings, that through the meetings that you've led, do you believe that this is realistic, that the process that you've led the community through has resulted in something that actually can be implemented effectively and successfully this summer? Do you believe that that's possible?
Thanks. You're stealing a little bit of my thunder for closing comments I was going to make. But yes, I am confident that we can get something stood up this summer, and something that has the feasibility of being used year round. Especially if we focus in on, I think, the one opportunity, which I think several of us agree on, which is the usage of pallet shelters and the opportunity that exists with those particular buildings. So if we can focus and hone in on that opportunity which exists before us, I think we can move forward with something that has year-round utility, helps us out during the summer, helps us out during the winter. Thank you.
I appreciate you saying that. I just don't think that the administration, the coalition, and a lot of folks who've been doing this stuff for a long time agree with you. And I think that the unfortunate thing is that a lot of people have done some really amazing work that I think is, to the point earlier, going to inform how we move forward on these things. I think this is incredibly important work that is going to help us to, in some form, develop sanctioned camps and do that in a really thoughtful way. I just don't think what you're hearing is that, and to the greatest point, the people who would actually be implementing it believe that it's possible for this summer. So I apologize for that, because if we could do it, I'd be all over it. So I'm happy to support it in the hope that we can do it, because if we could, I'd be 100% behind it. But what I'm hearing is that it's facing many challenges. So that's probably my last comment for this meeting. So thank you again for all the work you've done, and thank you for your engagement. And I hope you continue to stay engaged.
Mr. Martinez, Ms. Brawley.
Thank you. So I've asked this question at a few of the town halls or committee task force meetings, but I'll ask it again with respect to timing and our ability. If today there was a catastrophic event in our city and 400 people were displaced from their housing, what would our city do to respond? Would we wait till the winter or next year? Or would we have the ability to respond in a humane way according to disaster relief response efforts? I bring that, and if someone wants to respond, and I hope their answer is,
we would open schools, we would change our rec centers, and we would put people up immediately in a crisis emergency where buildings had fallen down. That's our emergency operations plan, and that's what we would do.
So then we say to ourselves, as the keepers of the code, which I just refer to Member Perez Verdier's point before, the role of the assembly is to really be in front of things with respect to, as best as we can, with code, with changes to allow for the stuff that we'd like to see in our community. It was highlighted today, for example, that there would be title changes necessary to even move any of these conversations forward. So I just think it's important to recognize that we have the ability to respond. We have work happening in our community. But on the other point that I wanted to flag, we have also determined that these sanctioned camps, as we're loosely calling it now, are not a replacement for housing, are not a replacement for shelter. So it seems that we can have the ability to think about, if we were to do it today, what would be required to get it off the ground, both in terms of the practice and in the code changes that are required to do it. So even to say, maybe not this year, but next year, still would require us dealing with code changes. And so, it strikes me as a little out of position and maybe that makes it more complicated with respect to the changes that are required to even implement any of these ideas. But I just wanted to confirm that that we would have the ability to think about how to respond creatively in our community. And if those buildings and those assets were also damaged in such a catastrophe, we would find another way forward with temporary solutions. But we should be thinking about long-term strategies, even if we're not getting something implemented today, our role in creating the code that allows best practices. Thank you.
Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. Just one additional, well, a brief response regarding disaster and then an observation. On the point of disaster, the other pieces that were not mentioned yet is that there would be a disaster declaration or a declaration of emergency by the mayor or another entity. And then there would be, in theory, resources from the federal or state government to support that disaster relief, usually in response to some acute event like an earthquake. And that is basically why we were able to pay for mass care for over 2 years with COVID, because we had federal resources that we spent our own money out of our savings. We are getting most of that back, but that is why we had the resources to provide shelter that we've never been able to provide in this community. And when those resources go away, we don't have an easy place to plug those. So I just want to put that on the table as well. That is a huge piece that is not there anymore. That is why we were able to provide this level of service. And the other observation I want to make, speaking of kind of longer term trajectory, part of the reason we're in this situation with our homelessness response generally, but with this issue of unsheltered individuals, is because of community opposition. And I'm glad that Ms. Johnson brought that up, because we can talk about the concept of camps, but we also have to talk about physical locations where they go and how they're managed and how they're funded. And every single location that has been brought up has been opposed. Every single location for a shelter has been opposed over, at least since I've lived here and since 2011. Every single location for low-income housing, or almost all of them, has been opposed. The locations for camps have been opposed, and the locations of individuals who are choosing somewhere where they are allowed to live in legal limbo right now on our trails, on our public lands, is also opposed. And so the end result of where we are now is years of opposition from this community. And so I really appreciate this conversation. I don't know the outcome of this vote, but I really appreciate the move to go from opposition to solutions. And I believe that that is where we need to go. And looking ahead to our shelter conversation, that is certainly where we will need to go. And I honestly am a little discouraged by whether this community is ready to really have that conversation. And I'm going to continue to push that we do, because what we have right now is not working, and people will be unhappy if we do not act. So again, I'm not saying this is the right action, but that is the situation we're in.
And I, again, had myself in the queue, and I will say people will be unhappy if we don't act, and people will be unhappy if we act. And so that's a simple reality that we face. And even among the members here, every time one of these places is the one that's in your neighborhood, I'm hearing champions against that site because X, Y, and Z. That's just the reality. And then what ends up happening is it all filters down and boils to the place where my district is, where my neighbors have put up with this for 30 to 40 years, because that's just the simple reality. Even though we have listed 5 places on here, we know that practically speaking, it's not going to happen there. Maybe in Mountain View. But so the reality is very harsh that we will face opposition no matter what we do. So I want us to grapple with that as early and as often as possible, because we aren't elected to do what people like. We're elected to do what's right and what's hard. And that's our job. And then we can be fired for it, or our neighbors can recognize the sacrifices and commitments we've made and send us back. Just depends, but that's reality. The failing I'm seeing here is that if we don't have a legal vehicle to move people because this, then people are not going to move generally. And then we will just have 5 more places where people are going to concentrate. And it's not going to be a solution. It's just going to be more of the same in more places without a real ability to manage it. There was an argument made or proposed that deciding to do nothing means this is what's going to happen. We have nothing to everything. But what we don't have is any other choice but yes or no on the matter before us. And there might be some crafty solution that could come out by resolution or amendment or S version that could achieve some middle of the road scenario. But at this point, we have yes or no on the document before us. And so that's what people are having to challenge themselves to figure out where their vote is at. Other than the item I haven't read, which is the new proposal for sanctioned camps is introduced. So we'll be having this conversation the next 2 meetings at least. I rebut any argument that what happened last summer was not a sanctioned camp or a homeless response. Just because you say something is something doesn't mean it isn't the thing that it is. And the thing that it was a place where we moved all the homeless people out of the Sullivan Arena. So that was a homeless response. Call it a sanctioned camp, call it whatever you want, but that's reality. And so I don't like us turning away from reality because it makes it easier to talk about. We just have to face it. And so I am not a supporter of sanctioned camps as a principle. I believe it's a compromise that says we've lost because the answer to this problem is housing, period, full stop. Housing is the most affordable solution. Housing is the only solution where the feds will help us pay at this time. Then shelter is more expensive than housing and it's all on us. And then camps, while it sounds like it's a cheap solution, is not a cheap solution. In fact, my challenge to the administration to get me to yes on any proposal is show me a budget. Show me a budget that we can push on a spreadsheet that demonstrates at least what we expect to go out the door before we at this table have to sort what goes into that equation, how we fund it. And so I struggle to yes because I cannot wrap my mind around the actual cost of this thing. This cost is vast. It's vast. It's not a simple, we just open it up and service providers will magically show up and operators will be there to do magic of their own accord. And we don't have to go through purchasing processes and figure out how to pay them. And then all of that money we're spending there, we're not spending on whatever solution we're being asked to deal with relating to a permanent shelter solution, which is still a Band-Aid on the real solution, but we still have to have it because winter is coming. So this is, for me, all of the areas where this debate raises questions that have to be sorted through by Tuesday. And the answers I have are yes or no. So that's where I'm chewing at right now. I thought I had Ms. Brawley and then Ms. Brunga.
I was only going to clarify, so we will face opposition and we are here because we have faced opposition for years.
For years. Ms. Brunga.
So if we had tiny homes, and this may be a dumb question that I haven't followed before, if there were tiny homes, are they considered shelters that HUD would help fund? Or are they considered homes or?
Through the chair to Ms. Branga, HUD doesn't normally fund shelter. The tiny homes, though, I believe would allow for it to fall under Martin v. Boise because in order for it to be shelter, it has to have 4 walls and a roof. And so these facilities would. And to the point of Mr. Perez-Verdia and to Mr. Rivera, I believe sanctioned camps are for outdoor camping. If they want to consider pallet sheltering as a form of sanctioned camp, I think we, as the administration, would be more amenable to be able to implement that sort of strategy. But 5 sanctioned camps around town, I don't think is feasible for us to stand up.
And then can I continue? So is there a way to have the discussion of pallet shelter pilot project pulled out of this sanctioned camp conversation? And how would that happen? Or, okay.
So I'll just say one last thing before I hand it to you, Mr. Rivera, to close. What has been framed as the do nothing option, which is to provide robust interventions where the people are, help organize those places, provide security, structure them where they are, it's anathema to me and my neighbors. They don't want that. They're dealing with it now. They've dealt with it for 40 years. They had 2.5 years of relief. They're begging for help. But if that's the answer, that isn't a no action alternative. Being assertive in the places where the people are And I just don't know how we cross the barrier from, hey, you're here, you can now legally be here. There's nothing we can do to get you there. You have everything you wanted here because this brought you here. How do we not create more of a mess with this? I don't know. Mr. Rivera.
Thanks. So I'm actually wondering if maybe before I give my closing comments, since we do have a few minutes, if we can ask someone from the task force to give some comments, and then I'll give one of the members at the table, if one of the members at the table would like to give some comments.
Charles Welch. One of the viewpoints that I had coming into it is everybody throughout town I don't want it in my backyard. Okay. And knowing that going in, I found that it was easier to chew on if it was smaller camps spread throughout town. Then it's going to equally offend everybody. I mean, simply that's what it is. We know that the Sullivan was a tremendous burden on Fairview. We know that Centennial was a tremendous burden on the Northeast. If we have smaller sanctioned camps throughout town, and yeah, this proposes 5. I'm thinking 5 is not nearly enough. I'm thinking several 30 to 50 person camps. My viewpoint isn't necessarily in here, but my viewpoint was outvoted. So the viewpoint that's here is the one that we're proposing. But I do believe that there's room for other camps, and going through the community councils and asking for their input is the next step. I know there's a lot of individuals in the communities and in the community councils who are going, I didn't know about this. We didn't know. Well, nothing has been approved yet. So that's the only reason they haven't been approached, is because we don't even know if it's something that can happen. So we didn't mean to offend community councils or individual areas of town, but it's because we didn't know what our next step was. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Just note that Mr. Vaughn is right at last. Go ahead, Mr.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, yeah, I want to thank everyone for this discussion. I knew going into this discussion that it wouldn't be easy because, frankly, anytime, whether it's shelter, sanctioned camp, anything with regard to homelessness, the discussion is just simply not easy. It's a difficult one to have. And, for some people, it really tugs at their heart. I think, one of the things as we move forward that we need to consider is, yes, I do believe that we need some additional shelter, and the clean slate strategy will get us to that avenue of additional shelter. But one of the things that I picked up on was someone talking about adequate shelter. And what we as a body, I think, really need to hone in and focus on is adequate housing. We're going to get more shelter, but adequate housing is the end goal and the end solution. And I always want to, even as we're talking about sanctioned camps, bring us back to that as housing is the solution. That said, what we have before us is what I call a stopgap measure, because housing is frankly 5 or 6 years down the line until we get all the housing that we really need as a community. 2,400 units of low-income, permanent supportive housing, extremely low-income workforce housing units. That's a lot. The last year, we were only able to stand up 300 units, and that in itself was a huge endeavor. Now multiply that up to 2,400, right? So, stopgap measure that we have before us. Now, I know there's been some comments about sort of what I got is a yes or no to the resolution that we have before us, and I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the administration doesn't want to really be in the position to make the decision of which encampments to decide. And so, as always, I am more than happy to step into the fray and make those tough decisions and get beat up for it. That's fine. So, what members will likely see is an S1 version on Tuesday that will encapsulate a lot of the discussion that we've heard today and will hopefully be a more palatable I didn't even think about that, but resolution for us to consider. I am open to realizing that June 19th may frankly not be realistic. But I am also guided, and this says it fairly clearly, that this is prepared by the Sanctioned Camp Community Task Force. And so the Sanctioned Camp Community Task Force said pretty clearly, we need to get this stood up as soon as possible, period, point blank. Now it's in our hands, right? And appreciate all the work of the task force. But now it is in our hands. So I am amenable to amending that start time to something that may be more realistic for the administration. When it comes to outreach can be incorporated into this plan. And I've already preliminary begun those discussions of if this is approved, what would the coalition's role be? I'm not going to speak for the coalition because they're not here, but I've already begun those discussions with them. This is another comment that was made about the coalition and the administration not agreeing with sanctioned camps. This is not going to be the first time that I've disagreed with the Anchorage Coalition and homelessness. And it's not going to be the first time that I've disagreed with the administration, and it probably won't be the last for either of those organizations. So I certainly respect and appreciate all of the various organizations, but also respect that I am in this role as a policymaker and in this role as a leader on this body and the chair of the Housing and Homelessness Committee, and am not afraid to disagree. If we can go to slide 26, please. So just based off of the discussion on this body, this is going to be one heck of a close vote when it comes before us on Tuesday. So even though this may not pass, even if I have an S1 version that is, I think, more amenable to folks, I will begin working on several of these items here. And we'll work with the chair to figure out a way to get these items before us on June 6th as as I said earlier, the next step of the plan. If we approve the resolution, there's further code changes and items that need to be handled. And so I will begin working on those, even though I don't know if this is going to pass or not. I won't make that comment. I will end just by saying thank you to the task force members. I know there are several of you in the room. In fact, I will just ask the task force members in the audience if you could just please stand up and be recognized for your work. Thank you. Thank you all for everything. I know these discussions can be difficult. Probably some of you feel really deflated right now based on these discussions. And just know that no matter what, we're going to keep moving forward because there is no going back. That we're going to keep working on the solutions. And I really hope that the task force members continue to engage in this throughout the rest of the existence of this task force and really engage in the task force final report on July 6th. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
According to my clock, we are adjourned. We have another meeting here starting, I think, in just a few minutes. It's a special meeting starting in 10 minutes.